How's it going, you guys? So I've been really interested in this tool for over a year now, and I'm really happy to finally be making a video about it, known as Nyxt. Now, Nyxt is a keyboard-driven and incredibly extensible web browser that I've been interested in. In fact, before it was even known as Nyxt, and back when it was known as Next, I took a few looks at it and found it pretty interesting, but never really quite convinced myself to switch over and really commit to the browser. Now, I'll talk a bit more about why I didn't actually initially switch and why I'm trying it out now a bit later on in the video. Now, while Next's keyboard-driven nature is really compelling and probably something that a lot of my viewers are interested in, it's not actually its major selling point. While its keyboard-driven nature is awesome, its actual selling point is its extreme extensibility. Now, if I've known about Nyxt for quite a while, why haven't I talked about it or made a video on it? And the biggest reason is I wanted the VI functionality to be a bit more featureful, which it's a lot better now, but it's not quite on par with something like Qt Browser. It is still functional though. I also previously wasn't very familiar with Lisp, and there wasn't really any creators that were actually talking about Nyxt or content explaining how you guys can customize it, and I wanted to be able to provide that, as well as I wanted the Qt web engine backend to become more accessible, because currently I tried to compile it myself and I had no luck. I was able to compile the GTK version, which is what I'll be using in this video, but I really wanted to try out the Qt web engine, which is the same sort of thing that Qt Browser uses, and I feel like that would make it a much more interesting battle between the two to see which one handles that better. Obviously, if the GTK implementation was better, I would have talked more about that instead of the poorly implemented one, because I don't think that's very fair to criticize something that's still in alpha, I believe. At this point, I've been using Nyxt for about a week now, and I'm really liking it. I've had my own customizations, my own color scheme, a lot of stuff like that that I will show off in this video, as well as explain how you guys can get started customizing it yourself and learning more. So when you guys first open up Nyxt, you'll be faced with a plain white interface that is a bit blinding when you first look at it, but once you get comfortable with it, you guys can start hacking and you'll learn a bit more about the browser. Now, the cool thing that you'll notice right away is that it actually offers the ability to restore history and use sessions. So say, for example, if you wanted to have like a session for work and maybe a session for home stuff, and you don't really want them to overlap in history or tabs and buffers that you have open, then this is a pretty useful feature. For now, we won't reload any sessions, and we'll just go ahead and just hit escape, and that will remove that. Now we can go ahead and immediately start looking at the cool stuff it shows off. So it has custom settings right here, where you guys can kind of just change what the default key bindings are. So it has the option to set it to KUA, which is the default, which is basically similar to most of the programs that you've probably used before, where you can use like the arrow keys to move up and down. Control C is cut, Control N opens a new window, all that sort of stuff that you may be used to if you're used to Chrome. Now there's also Emacs and VI bindings. So VI bindings would be like the same as Vim. So you can actually click these to change them, or you can actually do Control Space, which will give you this sort of command prompt. And this command system or prompt interface, as you can think of it, is actually super powerful. It supports features like fuzzy findings, so if I wanted to do em mode, it would match Emacs without having to actually type everything out. It also supports having multiple columns, as you can see down here, and multiple sections. And I'll try and show that off later on in the video, as long as I remember. Now, what I was pointing out before is that you can actually set the current mode. So if we wanted to have this with VI key bindings, then we could do VI mode. And then right down there, we just want to do VI normal mode. Now in this case, that won't really do anything because there's not really any scrolling or anything that we could do. But if we go to a different URL, let's just the actual Nyxt webpage. And then if we do command and we do VI normal mode, now if I do J and K, I can scroll up and down as you would expect. Now we can also disable it by doing, you can do Control Space to get that command and then hitting VI normal mode again. As you can see down here, it's removed that little VI. And I just realized that you guys couldn't see that. What I was referring to was right down here. So you guys can see that I'm in Emacs mode right now. So Control N, Control P, Control Space, and we can do Emacs mode, and that will hide it. Control Space again, and we can do VI normal mode, and then you can see it right down here. And then we can scroll with J and K. Now, just a few other things that the command options allow you to do. So say if we wanted to click on this FAQ, we could just do Control J, and this will actually give us a hint interface if you guys are used to Qt Browser or any VI-like interface for any other web browser. It'll usually have something like this. Now, in this case, we could do AO, and it will select this option right here. Or instead, we could actually just do FAQ, and it will give us some options. Now, if we just go down one option, bam, right there, we can select FAQ. So now if we just hit enter, it will select that, and we can actually just navigate kind of the same sort of way. So we could do AB, select that, Control J, FAQ, same sort of thing. So it's pretty powerful, as you can imagine. Now it'll also allows you to switch between tabs, which in this case are called buffers. Buffers act similar to how tabs work in most other browsers. So we could do Control XB, and then this will give us a prompt. And let's go ahead and just select the FAQ one that we were at before. Or if we do that again, we could actually switch to the other tab, which was the start page. Or we could, maybe if we wanted to open up a new tab, we could do Alt L, and then let's give it, I don't know, let's click on applications. All right, now we've got quite a few of them, so now we can switch between the three of them very easily, and it gives us a nice little preview as we switch between them. Now, if you wanted to learn more about Nyxt itself, there's a tutorial right here, which I recommend you take a look at. It goes over the basic bindings, the general stuff like the prompt buffer, which is basically this sort of thing that we have down here. History as well. History can also be accessed via the prompt buffer. So a lot of this stuff is done through the prompts. Now, a feature that Nyxt gets right that I rarely ever see any other Vim or Emacs inspired browser get right is the actual visual mode. So this acts very similar to Vim or Emacs, where you can kind of move a cursor around. So we can actually enable it just by doing visual mode. So running that command. So we can do Shift Space, and that's the default binding. And then with normal mode enabled, we can actually just use L and H to kind of move around. And then we can just do Control C to copy. And then now that we've got that text copied, we can actually look at our clipboard. So if I just open up my clipboard, you'll see that we actually have that text there. So we could just do Control V, and it will actually paste the text that we selected, which is pretty cool. And so it kind of allows you to avoid using your mouse as much, which is pretty awesome in my mind, especially for those of you guys that go pretty intense about avoiding using the mouse. Now, another spot that you'll actually notice a lot of help is down here. Now, I think by default, it's not actually bound to Control H. I think it's F1 and then something. So we could actually do F1, F1. This will take us to the start. We could do F1B for a list of bindings. We could do F1F for a bunch of functions, F1C. We'll kind of get into these commands and everything. So say if we wanted to learn more about visual mode, we could actually just do F1C and then visual mode. And then we get a nice little explanation of what it's intended to do. So this is that, just see the manual. And then it actually shows you the source code for those sections, which is pretty cool. And this will be a bit more important later on as we get a bit more into this. So considering that one of Next's biggest features is customization, let's get a bit more into how you guys can customize it yourself and kind of how the configuration actually works. All right, so getting into configuring Nyxt, you're going to want to make a directory. So in your home/.config, you're going to want to make a directory called Nyxt, and then you can cd into Nyxt, and then you're going to go ahead and you can just make a file called init.el. Now to configure Nyxt, you'll see that we use the keyword define configuration up here. So this basically allows us to define a configuration, and this configuration is specific to a class or a set of classes. Now, probably the biggest thing that actually scares people away is this idea of using a class. If you guys aren't used to object-oriented programming, don't worry about it too much, because common Lisp has its own sort of object system. It's inspired by things like Smalltalk, so it's very different from other object systems, but don't worry about it too much. We'll kind of explain how you guys can get started with it, and once you kind of get an idea of how things work, it'll make a lot more sense. So right here, I show off a really simple structure that we can actually go ahead and copy. And so here's how we can actually go ahead and start configuring it. So the actual structure would be define configuration, class name, and then in parentheses, we actually set all of our configuration inside of there. Now there's a bunch of different kinds of classes that you'll be manipulating. There's the browser, the buffer, and prompt buffer, a bunch of other ones out there, but really the base one that you'll probably be modifying the most for general changes that'll apply everywhere is the buffer class. So here we can go ahead and just mess with that. So let's go ahead and set buffer, and then we're going to probably want to change this stuff. So let's go ahead and start there. In fact, if you wanted to look up all the different kinds of classes, if I just actually go back to Nyxt and I do F1 capital C, then this will give us a list of all the classes. And so if we just did buffer, we'll have the buffer class, and then we have the prompt buffer, all that sort of stuff. And so when I'm referring to all these different classes and everything, these are just different things that we can customize. So buffer is basically any buffer. So if we go to our list of buffers, you'll see that there's actually the different types of buffers. So we have our help buffers and our tutorial buffers. These are usually just known as Nyxt internal buffers. But anything that we apply to the buffer class applies to every kind of buffer. And once again, a buffer is just basically a tab. So don't get too hung up on that idea. And so when it refers to a, like I said before, prompt buffer, that's referring to this actual interface right here, this prompt interface. So these settings, known as slots, like I mentioned before, are all totally customizable to the user. We won't worry too much about the internals and how slots work in common Lisp. That's not really too important, but let's show you guys how you guys can start customizing them. Now note that these slots are specific to each class. So don't think that, say, stuff like the data profile or something like that will be available for every class. You'll have to look at the documentation. So let's go ahead and do class again. Let's do prompt buffer. And then we can see that you can see right here, it's got like the input, the prompt, and all this sort of stuff that can actually be customized. Now note that a lot of these are not available in the normal buffer options. There you go. There's just kind of a good example there. Now let's go ahead and actually customize this a bit more. Now up here, you'll notice that we have some basic customization. So we can go ahead and copy that down into our configuration. And basically what I'm saying here, in fact, we can even remove this comment because it's kind of not really necessary, is I'm setting a slot known as session restore prompt, right? And so this is being set to never restore. Now, if we went here, we could actually do F1, I believe it's S. Yep, this will give us all the slots. So we could do session restore prompt. And so you'll see it's available in browser and user browser. Now you'll notice that instead of doing buffer, we're setting the browser information because this isn't needed in all buffers. This is only needed in the browser. So we'll set the session restore prompt. If I go there, you'll see it actually gives us all these different options of what we could have chosen. So we could choose always ask, always restore, and never restore. So here we've just set it to never restore. Now, if you ever wanted to learn more about how actually this define configuration works, well, we can actually even just go F1F define configuration, and it will actually give you a full-on explanation of how everything in this works. For example, like the slot default, this will actually have the default put into that slot. So the default for this, I believe, is just always ask. So say if we wanted to actually gain access to that, which I will show off in this little configuration setting right here. So let's just pull that down in here. There we go. So we've got this little configuration here. So I'm setting the default modes, all right? And I'm using the append to append Emacs mode to the default settings for the default modes. So that's kind of where this sort of can come in handy, is if you want to maybe extend it. You don't want to just full on replace things. You want to take advantage of what's already there. In addition, you can set more than just one slot at a time. So here I'm defining the configuration for browser, or for buffer, sorry. And so every buffer will have Emacs mode available. And then I'm also setting the slot for external editor program to Emacs client. And then in addition, I'm also doing some overriding. So here, override map, this will basically allow us to define some custom mappings. So I think by default, if you're in Emacs mode, Alt-X doesn't act as a execute command. So execute command is this like control space interface. So you can see right here, execute command. This isn't available unless you do control space in Emacs mode, but now I've just added a little override. So now I can do meta X, and that will give us something a bit more similar to how things work in Emacs. And then we can run commands from here. Now, I just wanted to try and clear things up a bit more. So if you guys aren't used to object-oriented programming, this may seem a bit strange, but let's just go ahead and clear things up a bit for you. So the define configuration applies to a class called buffer. Now, buffer is a big class. You can think of it as a general thing, kind of like saying human, and then humans each have their own name. So say there's a bunch of different kinds of buffers. Now, one of the kinds of buffers is a browser. So browser itself will actually inherit a lot of these different configuration things that we have done into it. So now a browser will also have Emacs mode always enabled. It will have the external editor program set to Emacs client, and meta X or Alt X will be available in every kind of buffer. So this will also be available in the browser. Now, some settings, like I said before, only apply to specific classes. For example, session restore prompt is only really needed for the browser. And once again, you can check that really easily just by doing F1S for a slot, and then we could do something like, I don't know, sleep timer is only available for these different classes. So there you go. That's kind of a general idea Or once again, we could just do slot, and we could go ahead and do session restore, and you'll see that it's available only in the browser and user browser. Now, something that a lot of people probably will want to do when they're customizing Nyxt is customize the appearance. Now, this can be done pretty straightforward. The idea is that it actually uses CSS and HTML to actually customize this stuff. So right here, I made a note of the message buffer. So let's go ahead and change the message buffer style. All right, and we'll see that it has the class of window. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Now, this is what it is currently set to. Now, as I mentioned here, you're going to want to note that the actual class is window. Now, if we went ahead and copied this, let's just copy that text. And then, so now going ahead, we can see that this is the text that we copied from here. We can go ahead and actually play around with this. So just once again, taking a look at this, what we're setting is the message buffer style. So what we want to do is define configuration for class of window. And then we want to put all of this in parentheses. Now we can go ahead and copy that into there. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is we can go ahead and see, okay, what we need to change is the message dash buffer dash style. And then this is what we are customizing it to. Now, obviously, this is just the default setting that we talked about before, but we can actually go ahead and change this. Now we can load these configuration settings into Nyxt by doing, oh wait, is this, yep, that should be all correct. We can do, now I've gone ahead and changed it. I've removed all the default settings just to make it a bit more simple, but I've basically set the background to black and the color to light gray. Now, since this is the message buffer style, the message buffer is right down here if you see this text. So if I went ahead and ran the command load init, so load init file, then, oh, we'll get a little error. Let's see what I messed up. Oh, these are not matching. There we go. So let's save that. And let's go ahead and run that again. Load init file. So sometimes this doesn't want to cooperate. So let's just go ahead and restart Nyxt. Usually it will work properly. There we go. Now it's reset. Oh, obviously removing the font size seems to have broken some stuff. So here's how you guys can actually add the defaults to this. So you can actually do str concat. So this will concatenate strings as the name applies. And we'll just go ahead and take this setting. And then we want to do the lot default. And I believe that is all we need. Save that, and then we can load init file. Now, as we can see before, for some reason, Nyxt didn't want to cooperate, so we'll just restart it. There we go, and now we have the default font size. So that's pretty nice. Now, usually just running the load init file works, but sometimes it is a bit slow to update. But usually if you have multiple windows, it will update the other windows for some reason. Now, for those of you guys with a bit of experience with CSS, you'll realize that, yes, once again, like I mentioned before, this is actually using CSS to actually customize everything. So the idea behind this is that it's actually just using CL-CSS as a sort of DSL or domain-specific language to represent this CSS rather than having to write plain CSS as a string. And then when I'm doing string concat right here, I'm actually concatenating the output of these. So this will actually all be evaluated and then turned into a string with the actual contents of the CSS. And this is basically the way that pretty much everything is customized. So the actual interface down here, this is actually done through HTML in a very similar way. And so that's kind of how everything is customized appearance-wise. So we can actually customize this. Once again, this is like the status, I believe it's called. So the status buffer, which we can customize. But I won't really go into all the details of all of those. I recommend you guys look at the slots and classes for those individually on your own. However, one thing I did really want to note is that because of the way that this is actually done, you can actually do really cool things like just remove the status buffer altogether. So this is what I do at the moment. I don't really know if I'll stick with this, but I kind of like the idea of it. Let's just see if it'll load the init file properly this time. No, it won't. Okay, I guess we'll just go ahead and close that. And then once it's opened back up, you'll see that there is no status buffer. And so this gives it a bit more of a minimal interface if that's what you're looking for. I think you can do the same sort of thing with the message buffer as well. Now, there are some really interesting things that you can do for actually messing with it a bit more. So if you wanted to interactively program with it, one of the big selling points of using Common Lisp, you can actually do start swank, which will start swank. And if those of you that are familiar with Slime, you can actually connect to it there. But since I use Sly, mostly just because I found it was easier to set up with StumpWM, maybe I'll go to Slime eventually, but right now I use Sly. And so I can actually just copy this configuration right here. In fact, I can just cut all that part out. And so this right here, so if I just go ahead and actually load this in, this will basically set up a Sly REPL that will interface with Nyxt. Low init file, start slank, and then let's start it on 1984. And then we can just go ahead and do Sly connect. I'll show that in just a sec. 1984, I think I set it to. And we get this little connection down here. So just in case you haven't installed it, you can actually do package install and then Sly. And then if you don't have Sly, it'll show up there. But now we have a Sly REPL going. Now something really cool is we can actually get some interactive stuff. So let's do switch buffer. So let's go ahead and just run that. And we can actually switch the buffer in here. All right. And so it gives you a much more interactive way to handle things. So you can actually interact directly with Nyxt from here. So now we can go ahead and actually mess with some of this. So let's take something from my personal configuration. So the status buffer isn't going to update properly. Maybe we can actually just steal this whole bit of configuration right here. What was this changing? This was changing the prompt. So there we go. So this will give us a dark theme for our prompt, which is pretty neat. And so we actually changed it without having to restart it. Now, if you were smarter than me, you probably would have actually thought through what you were doing rather than just copy and pasting it really quickly, trying not to think about it too much. But you can actually change some more stuff. So we can actually copy some settings for dark mode, which I have. We can actually change the colors of the internal stuff. So let's go ahead and try that out. Let's go to this guy, and we will get a dark interface, which is pretty neat. Now you can obviously enable dark mode right there, and this will give you a more dark theme. But this is gray, so what I usually change in my mode, so what I like to change in my dark mode is I just have it go straight to black, and then let's go ahead and just do select another thing, and there we go. Now we get a dark background. So you can kind of configure things at runtime, which is super powerful. But say, for example, if I had another command, so let's say quit, bam, and we just quit Nyxt from Emacs, which is pretty powerful. And as a result too, you can also have things like StumpWM interface with it. You can have a much more Lisp-centric environment because of this. Now, I don't think it's very fair for me to talk only positively about it. I should talk about some of the issues I have faced. YouTube videos often don't play properly, so I could actually go ahead and just do that, show that off right now. So if I just go to YouTube, let's just try. So this is kind of the sort of issue that you'll have, is that it will just kind of break and show something like this, which is not great. But there is a workaround that I have that allows me to play with MPV. I'll share my configuration later on at the end of this video, but it allows me to play my videos with MPV, which is a pretty good workaround and gets me away from the whole issue. YouTube Studio, like 90% of the time, doesn't seem to want to work with it. And history seems to just break like all the time. I constantly seem to run into this error right here. I end up getting this page could not be loaded every once in a while when I'm trying to navigate between history. In fact, I don't think I'll be able to reproduce it right now, but it seems to have issues very regularly. For the most part, these aren't all that big of a deal, but the biggest one that really kills it for me is the history issue. And that's one that I'm not really too sure if I'll be able to manage sticking with it purely because of that. But in the future, I will probably raise an issue and let the developer know. So maybe this won't be there in the future. It's my own fault that I didn't raise it to his attention before making this video. So stay tuned and I'll try and keep you guys updated on if this gets fixed. In fact, this could already be fixed and this could just be my fault. Now, if you guys have any questions, feel free to join me on Discord, as well as there is a very active forum that you guys can participate in, as well as an IRC chat that you guys can access. The developer is quite active and the IRC chat is pretty helpful. I've actually messaged in there every once in a while trying to get help, and people have most of the time been able to respond around reasonable times of the day. So I've been pretty satisfied with that. And finally, I just wanted to give a thank you to my GitHub sponsors, Platinus, Car, DFDX, and Tall Guy Jenks. I really appreciate all of your guys' support. If you guys want to support me on GitHub sponsors, you'll see a link down in the description. If you guys want to support this channel without actually supporting me financially, I'd really appreciate if you guys would like this video, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you guys will get notified of my next video. I've really tried to upgrade the amount that I am uploading videos, but even then, I don't upload enough that YouTube will always recommend it to you, so be sure to hit that bell so you guys get notified. Anyways, you guys, I'm really happy that you guys got to get information about this awesome browser, and hopefully we will get to see it improve. And if there's any major changes in the future, then I would love to talk to you guys about them and show off some of the innovations that it has come up with. Thanks, you guys, and I'll see you later.